My son told me I'd only ruin his new life. So I gave the business, the $2.40 M house, and the family yacht to his ex-wife, the one who used to visit me on birthdays. The ballroom was all glass and steel, like someone had bottled ambition and poured it into architecture. Lights beamed down on the stage, the logo of Benjamin's new company glowing behind him in shades of silver and gold. Investors in crisp suits sipped champagne. Reporters tapped on tablets. Sabrina floated from cluster to cluster, her red dress like a flare meant to demand attention. I had dressed simply, navy wool and pearl earrings, my hair pinned back in a knot. Not to compete, just to be present. After all, this was my son's night. I had believed I would sit quietly, smile at the speeches, maybe share a brief word about how proud his father would have been. I had not expected the blow to come so fast. I was standing near the front when the MC called for family remarks. I stepped forward, my hands steady though my knees ached. Before I could open my mouth, Benjamin seized the microphone, his jaw clenched, his voice sharp enough to slice glass. "You're a relic, Mom. A bygone antique with nothing but dusty stories. Don't ruin my new life." A journalist near the front raised his voice, pen poised over his notebook. "So you're saying your mother had no role in your rise?" Benjamin didn't hesitate. He leaned into the microphone, his voice cold as steel. "None. She only drags me down." The words hit harder than any slap. A hush fell, then the laughter rose sharper, recorded by every camera in the room. I felt the cut not in my skin but in my bones, the kind of wound that leaves scars you cannot see. The words cracked through the air like a whip. A silence fell, heavy and stunned. Then Sabrina leaned in with her smile stretched thin as cruelty. Seriously, she still uses a rotary phone. Laughter erupted, brittle and brutal, bouncing off the walls. A few investors chuckled into their glasses. One reporter smirked as he typed. My face burned, though I held it still. My heart trembled in my chest, not from weakness, but from the weight of recognition. I had just been erased in front of 100 strangers. My son's words were not just dismissal. They were declaration. He wanted the world to know that I was nothing but an old shadow, a burden, an obstacle to be discarded. A camera flash lit the room, and I noticed a young journalist in the corner capturing everything. He raised his lens again, eyes wide, as if he knew he had just witnessed blood spilled in a room that pretended to be polished. My hands tightened around the small clutch I carried, hiding the tremor. I did not speak. Silence was safer. Silence was sharper. If you've ever felt the sting of being mocked by your own family, smash that hype button right now. Let's honor every quiet builder's legacy and make their stories echo louder than cruelty ever could. The laughter at that moment was crueler than any storm I had weathered. I thought of the years I had carried him, the nights I stayed up balancing books to make payroll, the mortgage I had secured with my own savings to keep his first venture afloat. Yet here I was, dismissed as an embarrassment. Relic. The word ricocheted inside me. I could almost feel it tattooed across my forehead as they looked at me, not with respect, not with warmth, but with that thin mixture of pity and amusement reserved for something obsolete. Sabrina placed a hand on Benjamin's arm like she was crowning him king for cutting me down. He leaned toward her, the gesture intimate and smug, while the room swallowed their cruelty as if it were champagne. I stepped back, forcing my lips into what must have looked like a faint smile. The crowd shifted attention as Benjamin launched back into his pitch about innovation, disruption, and building the future. They clapped. They nodded. They pretended not to notice me at the edge of the stage, standing with my silence wrapped like a cloak. But inside my pocket, beneath the folds of fabric, my fingers brushed the smooth barrel of a fountain pen. To anyone else it was nothing, but inside its casing was a discreet button, a trigger. Months ago, with Kelly's help, I had prepared a clause hidden within the trust, one written not for vengeance but for dignity, a loyalty clause, a safeguard, a line in the sand. If ever I was humiliated publicly, if ever I was stripped of respect by those who owed me their roof and their fortune, the system would know, it would record, and it would act. I pressed my thumb lightly against the cap, feeling the pressure point, not enough to trigger, not yet. Timing was everything. I had learned in business and in life that the quietest moves created the loudest shocks. Around me, the room erupted into applause again, Benjamin basking in his spotlight as if nothing had happened. Sabrina waved at photographers, her smile polished, her cruelty hidden beneath lipstick and angles. But I stood still, steady, my body a statue in navy wool, my silence the only rebellion visible. The words echoed in my skull. Relic, rotary phone, dusty, antique. They thought they had defined me. They thought they had turned me into the punchline. They did not know the script was already written, waiting for me to whisper the final command. I watched them raise glasses, watched Sabrina accept compliments, and watched Benjamin boast of his self-made journey. And I wondered how many of them would still shake his hand if they knew the truth, that the deed to the house he flaunted was not his, that the yacht they toasted on was not his, that the very office they gathered in was secured by capital that bore my signature. I thought of Adelaide, the one who never forgot my birthday, the one who had once told me gently, "One day, Sophia, they'll see you are the foundation." And when the time came, when the night was over and the crowd had left, I would take my pen, press down with the weight of decades, and remind them all that relics do not vanish, relics endure. Relics hold history, power, and contracts signed long before anyone in that room thought to mock me. So I smiled, quietly, as the journalist's camera clicked again. He did not know it yet, but he had just captured the opening scene of a story that would outlast Benjamin's applause, a story not of relics, but of reckoning. And I was ready. I remember the winter of 2008 as if it never left my bones. The snow in Colorado was relentless that year, burying everything under silence and white weight. Benjamin was in his early 30s then, full of talk about scaling his real estate firm, convinced he was destined to outpace everyone else in the Denver market. But the crash came, sudden and brutal, and the empire he had barely begun to build trembled like glass in a storm. He came to me late at night, shoulders slumped, eyes wide with fear. A boy again, though his jaw was lined with a man's stubble. "Mom," he whispered, "if I lose this deal, I lose everything. I need capital, just enough to cover the debt until the banks ease up." He was shaking not from cold but from panic. I still owned a parcel of land in the foothills, nearly 20 acres my husband and I had once dreamed of turning into a retirement haven, a place with a wide porch, gardens, a view of the mountains stretching blue and infinite. It was worth millions, but in that desperate market no one was buying, unless I sold low, fire sale low. Against every instinct in me I did it, signed the papers, handed over a legacy, and gave him the liquidity that pulled his company from the brink. I told myself I was saving not just his business, but his spirit. A mother's heart does not measure return on investment when her child is drowning. Years later, when the market rebounded, when Colorado land prices soared to astronomical heights, Benjamin threw those same papers in my face. "You cost me millions, Mom," he spat one afternoon, his voice like acid. "If you had vision, we'd own half the state by now." He had forgotten the time when he was 9 and wandered too close to the tracks. When I lunged and dragged him back as the streetcar screamed past. He had forgotten the nights I signed away my own savings bonds to cover his tuition so he wouldn't be expelled. Back then he called me his hero. Now he called me controlling. To him, my sacrifices were no longer salvation. They were interfering. Too much, too heavy, too inconvenient for the man who thought himself self-made. I sat there, stunned. The same land he had begged me to let go of, now rewritten in his memory as my failure. Not his desperation, not my sacrifice, just my supposed lack of vision. It was then I understood something painful. Gratitude has an expiration date in some people's hearts, and when it expires, what remains is contempt. But the contempt did not stop with money. It bled into the smallest corners of life, the rituals that once bound us. Every year on Benjamin's birthday, since he was a boy, I cooked beef roast. It was our tradition, slow-cooked, seasoned, tender enough that he would lick his fingers as a child and grin at me, juice on his chin. Even when he became a man, he would say, "No one makes it like you do, Mom." It was the one dish that tethered us to the past, to home, to something real. Then Sabrina arrived. The first year she spent his birthday with us, she looked at the roast on the table with a curled lip and said, "Greasy, outdated." She placed her own dish in the center, a layered vegan cake, frosted green and white, decorated with edible flowers. "We're modern, Mom," she said, the word mom dripping from her mouth like mockery. "Nobody eats that heavy stuff anymore. Times have changed." Benjamin laughed with her, a sound that cut through me sharper than any knife. "Yeah, Mom, Sabrina's right. That roast belongs in the Stone Age." They blew out candles on the vegan cake while the beef roast sat untouched, cooling on the counter. I stood there, spatula still in my hand, my heart sinking under the weight of something worse than dismissal, replacement. My love, my labor, my tradition, reduced to grease. While her invention was crowned modern, what stung most was not just the erasure of my dish, but the double standard that shone through it. When I gave, it was outdated. When she gave, it was visionary. When I sacrificed, it was foolish. When she manipulated, it was genius. The rules were bent to glorify her and condemn me. And Benjamin swallowed every word. It was not the roast alone. It was photos removed from frames to make way for her decor. It was the way she told Charlotte, "Don't listen to Grandma's old stories. They'll bore you," while she posted threads of recycled wisdom online and called herself a thought leader. It was the way Benjamin defended her every jab, while holding my past against me like a crime. I began to see clearly then. The humiliation at the launch party had not been born in that ballroom. It had been cultivated for years, layered through quiet thefts of dignity, justified with the language of progress and modern life. I was always too heavy, too dusty, too behind. They lived on my sacrifices, but sneered at the tools I had used to make them. I kept cooking beef roast every year anyway, even when they rolled their eyes, even when no one touched it. I cooked it not for them, but for the memory of the boy who once grinned at me with juice dripping down his chin, the boy who no longer existed in their polished glass house. And each year, as I carried that roast back into the kitchen, uneaten, scraped into foil to save what I could, I wrote one more note in my journal, one more reminder of how far the scales had tipped, one more record of the hypocrisy, the cruelty, the double standards that marked the slow erosion of my place in their world. Those notes would matter later. They would become evidence, proof not of my bitterness, but of their pattern. Because justice does not always arrive in a shout. Sometimes it comes wrapped in silence, waiting, biding, counting the insults one by one until the scales balance themselves again. I learned to smile when Sabrina said, "We're modern, Mom." I learned to nod when Benjamin said, "You ruined our legacy." But deep inside, I knew the truth. I had not ruined anything. I had given them everything. And one day, they would learn the cost of confusing love with liability. Adelaide never forgot my birthday. It did not matter if Benjamin ignored it, if Sabrina accidentally scheduled their vacations right over it. If the phone stayed silent from morning until night, Adelaide always appeared. Sometimes with a little box of chocolates, sometimes with a scarf she had found at a thrift shop, sometimes with nothing but her arms around me and that quiet laugh that had once filled my kitchen when she was still my daughter-in-law. She would sit at my small table, the one shoved against the wall of the room they called my transition space, and pull out her phone. "All right, Sophia," she'd say with a grin. "Today you learn how to FaceTime properly, so you don't keep staring at your own forehead." I would protest, she would laugh, and then she would guide my hand gently across the screen until I got it right. She never mocked me for being slow. She never sighed or rolled her eyes. She simply sat there, patient, reminding me with every lesson that someone still believed I was worth teaching. And Callista, sweet Callista, was the sunshine that broke through the darkest clouds. My granddaughter would sneak into my room with her crayons, curl up at the foot of my bed, and chatter endlessly while drawing flowers, houses, and sometimes boats with big sails. "Grandma," she whispered once, handing me a paper, "if they're mean, just come live with me. I'll make you pancakes every morning." She was only 8 then, too young to know that pancakes cannot shield someone from cruelty, but her loyalty was a shield all the same. I thought for a long time that these two, Adelaide and Callista, were enough to keep me standing. But then Kelly returned to my life. Kelly had been my friend for nearly 40 years. We met when I was still a director at the tech firm, and she was the sharp young attorney everyone underestimated. We used to share lunches in conference rooms, trading stories about incompetent bosses and impossible deals. When my husband died, she was one of the few who didn't vanish in the awkward silence of grief. She called, she came by, she made me laugh again. Then life swept us in different directions. Me into family, her into the high-powered legal world. But somehow, when my humiliation at Benjamin's launch party went viral, Kelly saw it. She appeared at my door 2 nights later, coat dusted with snow, eyes blazing not with pity but with fury. "I watched the clip," she said, slamming her briefcase on my table. "The way he grabbed that microphone from you, the way she laughed at you, no, absolutely not. This ends now." I sat there in silence, unsure whether to cry or smile. "It's too late, Kelly," I murmured. "They've already erased me." She leaned forward, hands flat on the table. "Not if we make erasure impossible." From that moment, the wheels began to turn. She explained a framework she had been building with other lawyers, contracts designed for people like me, the ones stripped of dignity by their own families. She called it the Elder Respect Clause. The principle was simple, yet devastatingly effective. If I were ever publicly belittled, mocked, or humiliated by Benjamin or Sabrina, and the act was verifiable through witnesses, recordings, or written testimony, then all controlling stakes in Benjamin's company, the deed to the $2,400,000 0-cents house and the family yacht, would immediately transfer to a successor trustee. Not Benjamin, not Sabrina. Adelaide. When Kelly first spoke the name, I almost laughed. Adelaide? His ex-wife? Kelly smiled. Exactly. The one who still comes, the one who still honors you, the one who never asked for anything, yet gave what she could. If they think you're powerless, let them learn what happens when loyalty outweighs ambition. I sat very still, my heart a thunderstorm of disbelief and awe. Could I really do this? Could I really sign something that would strip my own son of everything he thought he controlled? But then I remembered the roast cooling on the counter, the land I sold in desperation. The words, "You cost me millions, Mom." The laughter, "Seriously, she still uses a rotary phone?" Yes, I could. I signed. Kelly's eyes softened as she closed the folder. "This isn't about revenge, Sophia. It's about insurance. The kind of insurance no one talks about, insurance for dignity. If they treat you with respect, nothing changes. If they don't, then Adelaide gets the keys." Adelaide, when she learned of it, cried. Real tears, the kind you cannot fake. "Sophia," she whispered, holding my hands tight, "I never asked for this." "I know," I told her. "That's why you deserve it." That night, for the first time in years, I slept without the weight of fear pressing on my chest. Because I knew, come insult, come laughter, come betrayal, they would never erase me again. Not legally, not financially, not ever. The clause was buried deep, invisible to them, silent as snowfall. But to me, it was the last fortress. My final insurance that my name would not be ground into dust by the very people who should have carried it forward. And when I closed my eyes, I thought of Adelaide's hand on mine, of Callista's crayon drawings, of Kelly's fierce voice saying, "This ends now." For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to believe that I was not alone, believe that justice, though slow, was still possible, believe that one day they would look at me and finally see not a relic, not an antique, not a burden, but the woman who built their foundation. And I smiled in the dark, because I already knew the foundation was about to remind them who laid the first stone. That night, long after the champagne glasses had been cleared and the laughter at my expense had faded into memory, I sat alone in my small room. The glow from the hallway smart lights bled under my door, flickering with every step Sabrina took as she barked orders at the staff. Benjamin's voice rumbled now and then, confident, celebratory, as though humiliating his own mother had been part of the grand performance. I waited until the house finally fell silent. Then I pulled the old cedar lockbox from beneath my bed and placed it on the desk. The key turned with a weighty click, the kind of sound that carries decades of memory. Inside lay the heart of my plan. A Matt Drek USB stick sealed in a tamper-proof case, and a small biometric reader no bigger than a pocket watch. I stared at them for a long moment. These weren't just tools. They were the culmination of everything Kelly and I had built together. The safeguard, the fortress, the invisible sword I had carried for years, while letting them think I was defenseless. My hands trembled as I connected the reader to the laptop. A thin blue light pulsed alive. The screen displayed a single line: Authenticate. I pressed my thumb against the cold glass surface. A sharp beep confirmed my identity. The screen shifted to reveal a command line blinking, waiting. I typed the words Kelly and I had chosen months earlier: legacy must be preserved. The words glowed once, twice, then dissolved. For a breathless second, nothing happened. Then the cascade began. Encrypted files opened in sequence. Smart contracts unfurled across blockchain ledgers, immutable and indisputable. The company shares Benjamin boasted about only last night, reassigned. The deed to the $2,400,000 0 cents home he strutted through like a king, transferred. The yacht, his trophy of wealth, the one he used to parade friends across the lake, keys reassigned. Not to me. Not anymore. To Adelaide. I sat back, heart pounding as confirmation codes flickered across the screen, each one sealing another lock Benjamin would never pick. Kelly's design was flawless, airtight, reinforced by multiple jurisdictions and notarized redundancies. It was not just a contract, it was a verdict. When the final confirmation appeared, I closed the laptop and exhaled. For years, I had lived like a shadow in my own home, shrinking at every scoff, enduring every reminder that I was an antique. Tonight, the shadow had shifted, and tomorrow the light would blind them. Across town, as dawn approached, Adelaide was pouring herself a cup of tea when her fax machine rattled to life. She frowned, adjusting her glasses as the paper slid out, line by line. It bore Kelly's letterhead. At the top, bold and undeniable, were the words, "Asset transfer confirmation, effective immediately." She skimmed the pages, her hand flying to her mouth. The company, the house, the yacht, all placed under her custodianship, pending Charlotte's majority. Her eyes blurred with tears as another envelope arrived by courier, slid under her door just as the first rays of sun touched the porch. Inside was a single silver key attached to a leather fob embossed with the yacht's name. Alongside it, a handwritten note. "This was always yours. He just didn't see it." Adelaide sat down heavily, clutching the key. She thought of the birthdays she had spent with me, the small gifts, the gentle laughter. She thought of the way Benjamin dismissed her after the divorce, reducing her to a footnote in his climb toward modern success. And she thought of Charlotte, the little girl who had once whispered that pancakes could keep me safe. She wept, not for the wealth, not for the assets, but for the recognition, the quiet truth that loyalty, overlooked for years, had finally been honored. Meanwhile, back in my room, I placed the USB back in the cedar box and locked it with a final click. The house was silent, but for the first time in years, I felt louder than any of its walls. Benjamin thought my silence was surrender. He would soon learn it was strategy. And as I lay down to rest, I whispered into the darkness, "Legacy preserved." The system had already obeyed. The next chapter had already begun. The downfall did not arrive like thunder. It crept in, one notification at a time, until the empire Benjamin had built on arrogance began to melt beneath his feet. It started with a clip. Just 45 seconds, shaky footage from a journalist's phone at the launch party. Benjamin yanks the microphone from my hands, his voice sharp and cruel. Benjamin yanked the microphone from my hands, his voice sharp and cruel, dismissing me in front of everyone as nothing but a burden from the past. Sabrina laughed into the mic right after, her voice dripping with disdain. Seriously, she still uses a rotary phone? And then the laughter of the crowd, the cut to my face, silent and still as stone. That clip spread faster than wildfire. By morning it was on Twitter, then Instagram, then LinkedIn, framed by captions like, "CEO humiliates his own mother at launch event." Blogs picked it up, then online magazines. By noon, the Denver Chronicle ran it under the headline, "The CEO who humiliated his own mother." The comments section was merciless. If he treats his mother like that, imagine how he treats employees. This is what happens when you worship startups instead of family. I wouldn't invest a dime in a man who mocks the hands that raised him. Within 24 hours, 2 of his major investors pulled out. One cited ethical concerns. Another sent a blunt email, leaked to the press. We cannot risk our brand being tied to a man whose moral compass is so visibly broken. By day 3, 2 multi-million-dollar deals collapsed. Conference appearances were canceled. His inbox overflowed with cold silence from partners who had smiled just a week ago. And worse, his bank called. The ethics clause buried deep in his corporate credit agreements had been triggered. Pending investigation, they said, all accounts will be temporarily suspended. It wasn't the money that gutted him, it was the humiliation of hearing the word ethics linked to his downfall. I didn't gloat. I didn't even check the news. Adelaide did. She called me, her voice trembling. It's everywhere, Sophia. They're calling him heartless. People are sharing stories about how their own families treated them. It's bigger than him now, I nodded. That's the thing about humiliation, I said. Once it's out, it doesn't shrink back. It grows. Sabrina, however, did not sit quietly. She stormed through the house like a storm given flesh. Plates shattered, doors slammed. Her voice was venomous. This is your mother's doing, she screamed at Benjamin. She's a witch in disguise. She planned this. She's destroying us. Benjamin sat at the kitchen island, head in his hands. Stop shouting, Sabrina, please. Just stop. But she didn't stop. Her rage turned sharper. You promised me. You said we were untouchable, that your mother was nothing but dead weight. Now look at us, pariahs. You let her do this. Benjamin looked broken, the shine gone from his eyes. He grabbed his phone, dialing with frantic speed. We'll fix this. We'll call the lawyers. There has to be a way to reverse the transfer. We'll challenge the clause. Sabrina snatched the phone. Do it faster before she takes everything else. But when the call connected and the video screen lit up, it wasn't just Benjamin's attorney staring back. It was Kelly. My Kelly. Her presence was calm, precise, and immovable. She adjusted her glasses and spoke before Benjamin could launch into his tirade. Benjamin Bartlett, she said evenly, you are attempting to interfere with a legally binding agreement. Let me be absolutely clear. You cannot undo what has been done. Benjamin's face went pale. Kelly, what the hell is this? You're supposed to be my mother's friend, not her weapon. Kelly tilted her head. I am her counsel, her ally, and her executioner, if necessary. The contract you signed years ago without reading included explicit consent for reallocation under the Elder Respect Clause. Your mother has simply enforced it. Sabrina leaned into the screen, fury etched across her face. This is fraud, manipulation, she tricked us. Kelly didn't flinch. No, fraud would require deception. What happened here was willful neglect and public humiliation, recorded, witnessed, and broadcast to the world. Every condition for activation has been satisfied, and now, every door you thought you could open is locked. Benjamin's voice cracked. I'll sue you. I'll sue all of you. I'll take this to court. You will lose, Kelly cut in sharply, and the deeper you dig, the more evidence will surface about your treatment of the woman who gave you life. Do you really want a jury to see that video again? Because I assure you, the world hasn't forgotten. Silence filled the room. Benjamin's hand shook as he lowered the phone. Sabrina muttered curses under her breath, pacing like a caged predator. And me? I sat quietly in my chair by the window, knitting as though none of it touched me. But inside I felt something rare and steady. Not triumph, not cruelty. Vindication. For the first time in years, Benjamin finally realized that I wasn't the relic he thought I was. I was the foundation, and his empire had just crumbled without me. The announcement was held in the old opera house downtown, the one with gilded balconies and velvet seats that had seen 1,000 stories of rise and fall. But that morning, it wasn't music filling the air. It was something heavier, something alive. A room filled with journalists, philanthropists, and investors who had once chased Benjamin but were now leaning forward, waiting for Adelaide. She stood at the podium in a navy suit that looked like it was cut from the fabric of resolve itself. Her hair was swept back, her voice steady, her presence undeniable. Cameras flashed as she adjusted the microphone, a quiet smile breaking across her face. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice carrying with the weight of history. Today isn't about a transfer of property or a sudden windfall. It's about a legacy. One that was hidden, overlooked, dismissed as dust. until the truth could no longer be buried. The crowd hushed, pens paused, screens lifted to capture her words. "She didn't just give me assets," Adelaide said, her voice rising. "She gave me back dignity. The dignity we all forgot. The dignity stolen when age was treated like irrelevance. The dignity erased when loyalty was repaid with humiliation." Applause broke through the room like a tide. People stood, reporters scribbled headlines before the sentence was even finished. Adelaide lifted her chin and continued, each word deliberate. "That is why I am founding the Legacy Keepers Foundation. Its mission is simple: to protect and empower women overlooked in their later years, to ensure that no mother, no grandmother, no widow is ever treated as disposable again. With the assets entrusted to me, this company, this house, this yacht, we will build programs, shelters, scholarships, and sanctuaries. We will build futures from the pieces others tried to discard." The roar of applause shook the walls. Cameras flashed until the stage glowed, and then Adelaide gestured toward the side of the stage. "Of course," she said softly, "none of this would exist without the true architect. Please welcome our honorary advisor, Sophia Bartlett." The applause deepened, waves crashing against the stage as I rose slowly from my chair. My steps were deliberate, my cane steady, but my heart raced with a rhythm I had not felt in years. When I stood beside Adelaide, she took my hand and raised it high. In that moment, for the first time since the night of my humiliation, I felt the crowd not laugh at me. The press would later call me the silent founder. Articles spun headlines like, "The grandmother who outmaneuvered a CEO," and "From relic to revolution." But standing there, I did not hear titles or accolades. I heard dignity, restored. I did not speak long, just a single line into the microphone. Legacies don't vanish. They wait, and when the time comes, they rise again. The crowd stood. Adelaide squeezed my hand, but somewhere else. In a smaller, darker corner of the city, Benjamin and Sabrina were watching the broadcast on a muted television. The glow of the screen painted their faces pale. Sabrina was the first to speak, her voice sharp, venomous, slicing through the silence. "You lost everything to your ex-wife and your old mother. Pathetic," she hissed, her eyes narrowing. "A CEO toppled by two women you swore were beneath you." Benjamin said nothing. His hands shook as he reached for the remote, turning the volume down even further, as though muting the sound could mute the truth. But the truth was already everywhere, on every headline, every channel, every feed. His empire was gone, his pride shattered, his name rewritten, and mine? Mine was finally remembered. The world now knew me not as a relic, not as background noise, but as the woman who outlasted the storm and turned silence into a weapon sharper than any sword. The courtroom was colder than the mountain air outside, a cavern of polished wood and fluorescent light where reputations came to die. Benjamin sat at the defendant's table in a tailored suit that suddenly looked too large for him. His shoulders caved inward as though the fabric itself rejected him. Sabrina, rigid and furious, flipped through stacks of papers, her manicured fingers trembling despite the performance of control. The judge entered, his gavel striking once, and silence fell. What followed was not a trial of crime, but a reckoning of consequences. One by one, the rulings came down. Benjamin Bartlett, the judge read, his voice like stone on steel. "Due to documented breaches of fiduciary duty and reputational harm to your shareholders, your operational rights are hereby suspended for a term of 5 years. You will retain title but not function. Decisions shall rest with the newly appointed Board of Trustees." A gasp spread through the gallery. Benjamin's head dropped. His empire was no longer his to steer. He was a passenger now, shackled by his own arrogance. Then came Sabrina's turn. "Mrs. Sabrina Bartlett," the judge continued, "your contracts and incentives tied to Bartlett Futures are deemed null and void as your conduct falls in violation of ethical clauses. Effective immediately, you forfeit all entitlements, bonuses, and revenue-sharing rights." Sabrina's jaw unhinged. "That's absurd! I built half those deals," she snapped, her voice cracking with a fury that sounded too much like desperation. The judge did not flinch. "You built illusion. The court will not uphold illusions." Applause wasn't permitted, but I felt it in the air. Outside the courtroom, the blows landed harder. The $2,400,000 0 cents house they once flaunted as a status symbol was no longer theirs to own, but theirs to rent, at 3 times the original mortgage, courtesy of the trust they mocked. The yacht, once Sabrina's stage for curated photographs, now required monthly payments wired not to them, but through me and Adelaide. Every weekend trip came with an invoice. For them, luxury had become a lease, but the sharpest wound came from Callista. She was only 12, but children know where safety lives and where disdain festers. One morning, when Benjamin tried to coax her into attending his family dinners, she shook her head. "I'd rather stay with Grandma and Aunt Adelaide," she said softly. He froze. The words weren't loud, but they cut deeper than any judge's ruling. His own daughter had chosen me, the woman he called a relic, over him. The sting was sharper than the rent checks, sharper than the frozen bank accounts. It was the kind of loss that left no paper trail, but destroyed a man all the same. The day of final confrontation came during the settlement hearing, the room smaller, quieter, almost suffocating in its intimacy. Benjamin turned toward me, his eyes red, his voice shaking with something between rage and regret. "You betrayed me, Mom," he choked out, tears streaking down cheeks that once carried the arrogance of certainty. "Everything I built, you took away. Everything I dreamed of, you gave to her, my own ex-wife." The room stilled. Sabrina glared at me with daggers, but for once her mouth stayed closed. I rose slowly, leaning on my cane, my gaze steady, my voice calm, not cruel, not triumphant, but unflinching. "No, son," I said, letting the words land like stones dropped in still water. "I didn't betray you. You betrayed yourself." The silence after was heavier than applause. It was the silence of truth, undeniable and immovable. Benjamin slumped back into his chair, shoulders collapsing like a ruined structure. Sabrina turned away, lips pressed thin, already calculating her next move in a world that no longer bent to her will. And me? I stood taller than I had in years, because I knew this wasn't vengeance anymore. This was balance. This was dignity, finally restored. For the first time, I felt no tremor in my hands, no doubt in my chest. The empire he thought he lost was never his to begin with. It had always been mine, and now the world finally knows it. 6 months later, the world had changed its tune. Benjamin and Sabrina, once the self-proclaimed royalty of Colorado's rising elite, were now tenants, bound by leases and invoices, tethered to the very assets they once thought untouchable. Every first of the month, without fail, their payments arrived. Rent for the house that bore my late husband's craftsmanship, fees for the yacht that once hosted their champagne-soaked charades. They paid on time, not out of pride, but out of necessity. Pride had long since deserted them. I did not gloat. I simply filed the checks, sent acknowledgments, and let the silence of their compliance be its own lesson. Meanwhile, life bloomed elsewhere. Adelaide and I had turned the assets into more than possessions. They had become foundation. The Legacy Keepers Foundation thrived, its programs expanding from workshops for older women into full mentorship networks, teaching financial resilience, digital literacy, and something harder to quantify, dignity. We didn't just restore lives, we preserved them. The night of the gala, the ballroom shimmered with warm light. Crystal chandeliers spilled golden reflections across polished floors, and women from all walks of life filled the room with the hum of laughter, conversation, and resolve. Adelaide stood at the podium, her voice carrying with it a steadiness that only comes from surviving storms. I sat beside the board, watching her speak not just for herself, but for every woman who had once been told she was too old, too late, or just the babysitter. When the applause roared, Callista darted from the crowd like a spark of joy, her little arms wrapping around both Adelaide and me at once. She buried her face against us, giggling. "You're the best team." At that moment, no award or donation matched the weight of her words. Later, when the gala wound down and the city lights blinked awake against the night, Adelaide suggested we take the yacht out. Not for spectacle, not for photographs, but for quiet. The water was calm, a mirror of copper and lavender as the sun bled into the horizon. We sat on the deck with the wind curling strands of hair around our faces, the sea carrying the faint scent of salt and freedom. Neither of us spoke at first, We didn't need to. Our laughter from earlier still lingered, soft echoes in the dusk. Adelaide glanced at me, her eyes catching the last light of day, and smiled. It was not the smile of triumph, nor of conquest. It was the smile of a woman who had chosen loyalty over convenience, kindness over calculation, presence over absence. I returned the smile, and in the space between us there was no bitterness left, no vengeance, only the quiet, undeniable knowledge that we had weathered storms and found ourselves still standing. Callista padded across the deck, her hair lit like a halo by the sunset, and plopped down between us. "Grandma, Aunt Adelaide," she said, "this is the best day ever." I kissed the top of her head. Adelaide squeezed her hand, and for the first time in many years I felt whole, not because of what I had regained, but because of what I had remembered. As the sun sank, painting the water in fire and wine, I leaned back against the railing, let the evening settle into my bones, and whispered the truth that had carried me here. I didn't win. I simply remembered who I am, and who deserves to be remembered. Our wrinkled hands found each other, fingers intertwining like roots that had weathered every storm. Two women, two survivors, two builders of legacies, smiling, not in triumph, but in quiet endurance. In that touch, there was no need for words. Happiness had already spoken. We were no relics. We were the roots, still alive, still holding, still carrying the weight of every branch above us. And that, my dear, is the end of my story. A story of a so-called relic who chose not to fight with noise, but with patience, planning, and dignity. They thought they could erase me, but instead I wrote myself back into the foundation of everything they once took for granted. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you were too old or just in the way, remember, silence can be power, and legacy is written by those who endure. And if stories like mine touched you, if they remind you of your own grandmother's strength or the quiet power you carry yourself, don't let this moment fade. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories, where every tale is a reminder that wisdom doesn't retire and respect is never optional. I'll be here, waiting, with the next story.